This is Digaris Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. This is flyer number 604, entitled Masculism's Broad Historical Sweep. Description. This flyer takes the view of future gender political historians who ask themselves how masculism changed society in broad historical sweeps, the way feminism caused women to be careerists. Women were fipped up. The divorce courts were reformed. A FIP society was created. The GECs in the parliaments were created. The PARA and OPTAB were legislated. Several decades later, gender politics had largely died out, since both sexes took for granted that both sexes had equal rights and equal obligations. So the need for a masculist movement like feminism died out. The flyer itself. Masculism's Broad Historical Sweep by Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. Email profhugodigaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodigaris.wordpress.com. This flyer aims to predict what future historians of gender politics will make of the rise of masculism in the early 21st century. What will they consider to be the major social changes that masculism caused? ? For those readers/viewers who are not clear on what I'm talking about, consider the corresponding question for feminism. What broad, historically sweeping social changes did the rise of feminism over the past century have on women? ? I think the biggest change that feminism had on women over the past 50 years is the rise of women's careerism. That is, a fundamental shift away from the traditional housewife role of the 50s and 60s to the career woman of the 70s and beyond. Of course, it was men who indirectly created this major historical shift in women's role, women's self-image, by inventing the contraceptive pill, the great enabler that freed women from being constant baby factories and child raisers. It was men who invented and gave women household gadgets and higher education. Most importantly, it was men who gave women men-invented science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years and hence a career window of half a century, which caused millions of women to stream into the workforce to avoid the ennui of decades of boredom rotting in the house once her kids were off to kindergarten and school. It was this new female careerist role that freed men from being man's slaves to women, working for women for decades of men's lives, a terrible price for men to pay just to get some regular sex from a woman. Thus, women's careerism, from a masculinist perspective, was the great enabler to free men from man's slavery by women. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man's slaves to women, working for women for decades of their lives, and then being divorce raped at a rate of 1 in 4 of married fathers. The rise of masculinist ideas, as seen from the point of view of future historians of gender politics, took place largely in the 2020s due to the rise of specialist media platforms devoted to men's interests that spread masculinist and MGTOW, that's men going their own way, ideas across the planet to hundreds of millions of men, changing their self-image away from being a man's slave to a woman to being a much more of a free agent, doing what he wanted to do with his life rather than what some dependent parasitic woman wanted him to do, that is, to help pay for her to raise children. It was during the 2020s, in brackets, again as seen by these gender political historians, that masculinists caused women's attitudes towards men to change. Prior to the rise of masculinism in the 2020s, women, that is feminists, had had a monopoly over gender politics for the past 60 years, so women felt fully justified in despising men's treatment and attitudes towards women. Feminism taught that gender oppression was a one-way street. That is, that it was women who were oppressed and it was men who were the oppressors. For 6 decades, the only gender politics that women, that society, heard was this monoconscious feminist doctrine. Then masculism burst on the scene in the 2020s, preaching that gender politics was very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppressed men worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men lasted decades, which made them a lot more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppressed women. For Mascus, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, was seen as rather small beer in comparison with the horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men. The big 3 being women's man's slavery, living off a man's money and labour for decades of his life. Women's divorce rape, ripping his kids away from him with a 90% probability, forced to lose his house to her, half his wealth, half his stuff, forced to pay for his kids that he was barely allowed to see, and to pay alimony to a fluffy wife with no legal nor moral obligations on her to fip up, so that she continued to parasite off him, manslaving him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Women's forced fathering, forcing men to pay for kids they didn't want for decades of their lives. In the 2020s, there were millions of acrimonious, emotionally bitter verbal confrontations between bi-conscious masculists and monoconscious feminists who had been brainwashed all their lives that gender oppression was a one-way street, giving them an attitude that it was perfectly reasonable to feel resentful towards men's oppression of women, which the masculists seemed strongly hypocritical and bigoted, since the masculists were convinced by their masculist ideas that gender oppression was very much a two-way street, and that women oppress men worse. So these many verbal confrontations between monoconscious feminists and bi-conscious masculists were bitter and often led to physical violence. By the end of the 2020s, most women had been educated by the masculists that gender oppression was a two-way street. And any monoconscious feminist who publicly made misandrous remarks deserved to have her head bitten off by extremely angry bi-conscious masculists who saw her as an MFB, that's a monoconscious feminazi bigot, and ripped into her with a verbally violent masculist diatribe, teaching her how women oppress men far worse, and telling her that if she didn't convert herself into a bi-conscious feminist, then her male feminist boyfriend would dump her once he had had his masculist consciousness raised. Thus, by the 2030s, the feminists had lost their monoconscious arrogance. They had become largely universally bi-conscious, so lost their monoconscious anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, since they could see that women oppress men far worse, with women's horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men, manslavery, divorce, rape, forced fathering, etc. As most men became masculisted, fluffy women were left rotting on the shelf, spat at by most men, seen as immoral, manslaving, divorce-raping, vermin parasites. So young women poured into the career-competent STEM fields and the professions in order to attract the attention of a man. The masculists pushed for and installed GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consisted half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes were dealt with equally. Those monoconscious feminists who complain that giving men's issues more time and energy in the parliaments would only lower the time and energy spent on women's issues. These monoconscious feminist politicians had their heads chewed off by extremely angry male masculist politicians in the GECs who spat at such women, telling them they were monoconscious bigots and hypocrites who saw men's oppression of women worse than vice versa, when the reality was that the reverse was the case, making these monoconscious feminist politicians seem like ignorant fossils who deserved to be chewed out and were chewed out. The gender politicians in the Gex then set about to men-fair the gender laws so that men would be more prepared to be fathers again by fipping the society, creating a FIP society, where particularly young girls were socialised by parents and taught by teachers to be FIPs and not expect to manslave a man and then divorce him in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, which the masculist politicians in the Gex reformed out of existence, throwing out alimony, scrapping the halving of wealth and stuff, making custody of kids joint by default, etc. The divorce courts were made to operate on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, since we lived in a FIP society where nearly all women were FIPs and hence by definition financially independent. The Gex passed the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, the lack of which, given that women had the MARA, was considered the most blatant of sexual discriminations that existed. Similarly, the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth, was also passed to block women's paternity fraud, one of the worst gender crimes that millions of women committed against men, forcing him to pay for a kid that he didn't want, and in the case of paternity fraud, for a kid that was not even his. Society thus became, under masculism, a much fairer society that accepted not only equal rights between the sexes, but equal obligations as well, especially by women, who were expected to pull their financial weight by fipping up and not expecting to manslave and divorce rape a man. Women thus lost their feminazi arrogance and became a lot more gender politically humble, since they knew that if they expressed traditional monoconscious views that gender oppression was a one-way street, then they knew they risked some masculists in their audience or their social circle or work environment would bite their fucking heads off in a violent verbal attack that women soon learned to fear and to avoid, since a very angry man who directs his wrath at a woman can be terrifying to that woman. As the decades passed from the 2030s into mid-century, gender politics largely died out as an issue, especially in the rich first world countries, as both sexes essentially lived the same careerist lifestyle, since women had a career window of half a century, so were expected to be FIPs and were FIPs. As the population crash continued, pressure grew on governments to push both sexes to be parents again. So government propaganda onto both sexes to have babies grew and grew as a means to avoid population annihilation. Governments gave hefty motherhood wages to women to stay at home while their kids were small, and so that the entire burden of earning the living for the family was not placed on the shoulders of the husband, the father. These motherhood wages kept increasing until women chose to be mothers again and men agreed to be fathers again, since the divorce courts were men-friendly and men-fair. The gender laws were men-faired, so masculine consciousness became a thing of the past, a topic only for historians of gender politics. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 600 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.